China just deployed something in the Taiwan Strait that military planners in Washington have been dreading for 3 years. Not a new aircraft carrier, not a hypersonic missile. Something far more calculated, far more difficult to counter, and far more dangerous to every assumption the United States Navy has been operating under since 1949. In the span of just 72 hours, Beijing demonstrated a capability that makes the entire U.S. strategy for defending Taiwan suddenly, terrifyingly obsolete. This was not a drill. This was not posturing. This was a message written in technology the Pentagon did not see coming. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I am about to show you is not speculation about what might happen in a future Taiwan crisis. This is analysis of what just happened, what it means for American naval dominance in the Pacific, and why the balance of power in the most strategically vital waterway on Earth just shifted in ways that should concern anyone who cares about global stability. I am going to walk you through exactly what China deployed, why it represents a fundamental breakthrough in anti-access warfare, and how it exploits vulnerabilities in U.S. naval doctrine that have existed for decades, but were never this exposed. We will cover the specific technology Beijing just demonstrated, the tactical implications for American carrier strike groups, the strategic consequences for Taiwan's defense, and the second-order effects on alliance structures across the Indo-Pacific. By the end of this video, you will understand why senior naval officers are having very uncomfortable conversations right now about whether the United States can still guarantee Taiwan's security, and why this development changes the calculus for every nation that depends on American military power for deterrence. Let me give you the strategic background that makes this development so significant. The Taiwan Strait is not just another waterway. It is the geographic feature that has defined great power competition in Asia for 75 years. This 100-mile-wide channel separating mainland China from Taiwan represents the front line of the fundamental question of the 21st century, whether authoritarian regimes can forcibly alter borders or whether the international order established after World War II still means something. For the United States, the defense of Taiwan has been the cornerstone of Pacific strategy since the Chinese Civil War ended, with the communist victory on the mainland and nationalist retreat to the island in 1949. The American approach to Taiwan's defense has relied on a single overwhelming advantage: naval dominance. U.S. carrier strike groups operating in the Western Pacific have represented an unambiguous threat to any Chinese attempt at amphibious invasion. The logic was simple and brutal. China might be able to assemble invasion forces on its coast, but getting those forces across the strait while American carriers sit off the eastern coast of Taiwan launching strike after strike would be suicidal. That calculus kept the peace. Beijing knew that any move against Taiwan would trigger American intervention, and that intervention would mean the destruction of Chinese invasion fleets before they reached Taiwanese beaches. But that calculus depends entirely on the survivability and operational freedom of U.S. carrier strike groups. A carrier is an extraordinarily powerful weapons platform, but it is also an extraordinarily expensive and vulnerable one. $11 billion of hardware, 5,000 personnel, and 60 aircraft all concentrated in a single floating target that, if sunk, would represent the most catastrophic loss the United States Navy has suffered since World War II. Carriers survive through layered defenses. Submarines providing undersea protection, destroyers and cruisers forming an anti-air and anti-missile screen, early warning systems detecting threats hundreds of miles away, and simple distance keeping the carrier far enough from hostile shores that most threats cannot reach it. China has spent 2 decades building what military analysts call anti-access area denial capabilities, or A2AD. The entire strategy is designed around one objective: making it too dangerous for American carriers to operate close enough to Taiwan to matter. This includes DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles that can theoretically strike carriers from inland launch sites, submarines that could hunt carrier groups in contested waters, land-based aircraft armed with long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, and layered surface-to-air missile networks that would contest American air superiority. The A2AD strategy does not require China to defeat the U.S. Navy in open battle. It only requires making the cost of intervention high enough that American presidents hesitate before committing to Taiwan's defense. The problem for China has always been targeting. Finding a carrier strike group in the open ocean is extraordinarily difficult. The Pacific is vast. Carriers move. They practice emissions control, limiting radar and radio signals that could give away their position. They deploy electronic warfare systems that can deceive or jam enemy sensors. For China's missiles to work, Beijing needs to know exactly where the carrier is, track it in real time as it maneuvers, and update targeting data continuously during the missile's flight. That kill chain, find the carrier, track the carrier, hit the carrier, has always been the weak point in Chinese strategy, until 72 hours ago, when China demonstrated they may have solved it. Here is what happened. On April 9, 2026, the People's Liberation Army Navy conducted what Beijing officially described as routine naval exercises in the Taiwan Strait. These exercises have become almost monthly occurrences, deliberate demonstrations of Chinese military presence in waters Beijing claims as its own. The pattern is familiar. Surface combatants transit the strait, aircraft conduct flights near Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, and state media releases footage emphasizing the PLA's readiness to reunify Taiwan by force if necessary. The United States typically responds by deploying surveillance assets to monitor Chinese movements and occasionally sending a destroyer through the strait on what Washington calls freedom of navigation operations. But this exercise was different. Multiple open-source intelligence analysts monitoring satellite imagery and ship tracking data noticed something unusual. Chinese naval vessels were not conducting typical transit operations. They were establishing a distributed sensor network across a 200-mile area of the Western Pacific, positioning ships and unmanned surface vessels in a geometric pattern that suggested coordinated surveillance rather than combat maneuvers. Then on April 11th, the USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, operating approximately 300 miles east of Taiwan, detected something that triggered immediate alerts up the chain of command. Multiple Chinese reconnaissance drones, not the typical high-altitude platforms but small, sea-skimming autonomous vehicles, penetrated the carrier group's defensive perimeter. These were not armed, they carried no weapons, but they did something more significant. They tracked the Reagan's position with accuracy measured in meters, transmitted that data in real time to multiple Chinese vessels and ground stations, and demonstrated loiter time of over 8 hours, meaning they maintained contact with the carrier group through an entire operational cycle. The Reagan's defensive systems detected and engaged several of these drones, but not before they accomplished their mission. And here is the critical detail that should concern anyone paying attention. For every drone the carrier group detected and destroyed, intelligence assessments suggest 3 to 5 more maintained contact without being identified. These platforms are small, cheap to produce, extremely difficult to detect with traditional naval radar systems, and capable of operating in coordinated swarms that share targeting data across the network. Think about what that means for a moment. China just demonstrated the ability to track a U.S. carrier strike group in real time using disposable drone swarms that cost a fraction of what the Navy spends on a single SM-6 interceptor missile. The economic exchange ratio is devastating. If it costs China $5,000 to produce a drone and the United States $2 million to shoot it down, Beijing can afford to flood the battle space with enough platforms that some will always get through. And those that get through provide the targeting data that makes China's anti-ship missile arsenal genuinely dangerous. But the technology itself is only half the story. The strategic implications extend far beyond this single demonstration. Let me show you exactly how this changes the tactical calculus for U.S. naval operations in a Taiwan crisis. The fundamental problem facing American carriers in a conflict over Taiwan has always been geography. Taiwan sits roughly 100 miles from mainland China. That proximity means Chinese land-based aircraft, missiles, and sensors have inherent advantages. They can operate from prepared bases with full logistical support. They can surge sortie rates that no carrier can match. And they can retreat to the protection of China's integrated air defense network, forcing American strike packages to fight their way through layered SAM systems just to reach their targets. For carriers to be effective in Taiwan's defense, they need to operate close enough to the island that their aircraft can conduct sustained combat operations. The FA-18 Super Hornet, the Navy's primary strike fighter, has a combat radius of approximately 500 miles. That means to strike targets on mainland China or to provide air cover over Taiwan, carriers need to position themselves within 600 miles of the Chinese coast, accounting for the distance aircraft need to penetrate hostile airspace. But positioning carriers that close creates enormous vulnerability. This is where China's drone swarms become genuinely dangerous. In open ocean, a carrier group's defensive perimeter might extend 200 miles in all directions, creating a massive area that hostile forces must penetrate to threaten the carrier itself. But if small, difficult-to-detect drones can infiltrate that perimeter, maintain contact with the carrier, and relay precise targeting data back to Chinese missile commanders, then the entire defensive concept breaks down. The DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missile has a range estimated at 3,000 miles. That means it can strike anywhere in the Western Pacific from launch sites deep inside mainland China. But actually hitting a moving carrier requires real-time targeting data. The missile's terminal guidance system needs to know where the carrier is within a relatively small area, typically a circle with a radius of about 30 miles. Traditional reconnaissance methods, satellites passing overhead on predictable orbits, long-range maritime patrol aircraft that carriers can detect and shoot down, have never provided the kind of persistent, real-time tracking necessary to make these missiles reliably effective. China's drone swarm demonstration suggests Beijing may have solved this problem. If autonomous platforms can maintain continuous contact with a carrier group, updating its position every few minutes, then Chinese missile commanders can launch anti-ship ballistic missiles with confidence that their terminal guidance will acquire the target. The carrier's traditional defense, maneuver, and deception becomes far less effective when the adversary has persistent eyes on target. Now layer in the second element of what China demonstrated. These drones were not operating independently. They were networked, sharing data across the swarm, and transmitting to multiple receiving stations simultaneously. That distributed architecture means you cannot break the kill chain by destroying any single node. Take down one drone, and 4 others maintain contact. Jam the communications link to one receiving station, and the data routes through alternate paths. The resilience of this system represents a fundamental challenge to traditional naval air defense. The U.S. Navy's response options are limited, and none of them are good. Option 1. Attempt to shoot down every drone that approaches the carrier group. This rapidly depletes missile magazines, creates opportunities for saturation attacks, and may not even be technically feasible given how difficult these small sea-skimming platforms are to detect and track. Option 2. Increase the standoff distance, operating carriers farther from Taiwan to reduce exposure to Chinese missiles. But this reduces the carrier's effectiveness, increases tanker requirements for strike aircraft, and may position carriers too far away to provide meaningful support to Taiwan's defense. Option 3. Accept the risk and operate within range, gambling that Chinese missiles will not perform as advertised or that American defenses will prove adequate. This is a very expensive gamble with a very high-value asset. But there is a third-order effect here that extends beyond the immediate tactical problem. Every nation in the Indo-Pacific that depends on American security guarantees is watching this development very carefully. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, all of these nations have defense strategies built on the assumption that the United States can project overwhelming naval power into contested waters. If China can credibly threaten American carriers with relatively cheap autonomous systems, then the entire architecture of regional deterrence begins to look shaky. Think about Japan's perspective. Tokyo has been strengthening its military capabilities specifically to support U.S. operations in a Taiwan contingency. Japanese bases would host American aircraft, Japanese destroyers would integrate into carrier strike groups, and Japanese submarines would hunt Chinese naval forces. But this cooperation depends on confidence that the United States will actually fight for Taiwan and that American forces can win. If Chinese drone swarms can track and potentially sink U.S. carriers, does Japan want to risk its relationship with Beijing by supporting an American intervention that might fail? The same calculation applies across the region. The Philippines just granted the United States access to additional military bases, specifically to support operations in a Taiwan crisis. Australia is investing billions in submarine capabilities designed to operate alongside the U.S. Navy. South Korea is expanding its amphibious capabilities that could theoretically support Taiwan relief operations. All of these decisions were made based on assumptions about American naval dominance that China just called into question. Beijing understands this psychological dimension perfectly. The goal is not necessarily to sink American carriers in actual combat. The goal is to create enough doubt about carrier survivability that Washington hesitates to intervene and regional allies hesitate to support that intervention. If China can achieve that doubt through technology demonstrations rather than actual warfare, they accomplish strategic objectives without firing a shot in anger. Let me show you the economic dimension of this development because it matters just as much as the military analysis. The United States currently operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Each one represents a minimum investment of $11 billion, not counting the cost of the air wing, the escort vessels, the submarines, or the logistics infrastructure required to keep a carrier strike group operational. The total lifecycle cost of a carrier strike group over its 50-year service life exceeds $100 billion. China just demonstrated a capability to threaten that investment using technology that costs at most a few $1 million per deployment. The autonomous drones that track the Reagan probably cost between $5,000 and $15,000 each to produce. The larger unmanned surface vessels coordinating the sensor network might cost $500,000 to $2 million each. Even if China deployed 100 platforms in this demonstration, the total cost was probably under $50 million. That is less than the cost of a single F-35C fighter aircraft, and China used it to fundamentally challenge the operational viability of an $11 billion carrier. This economic asymmetry is precisely what strategists worry about when they discuss A2AD and the future of naval warfare. If the defender, in this case the United States, must invest billions in platforms while the attacker can threaten those platforms with weapons costing millions or less, the defender faces an unsustainable economic equation. The United States cannot afford to build enough carriers to accept losses, and cannot afford to deploy enough defensive systems to guarantee their protection, while China can afford to mass-produce the autonomous systems necessary to threaten them. The Pentagon has been studying this problem for years. The term they use is distributed maritime operations, a concept that envisions replacing large, expensive, vulnerable platforms like carriers with larger numbers of smaller, cheaper vessels equipped with long-range strike capabilities. But implementing that vision requires fundamentally restructuring the Navy, retiring or reducing carrier production, and investing in technologies that do not yet exist at scale. That transformation will take decades and enormous political will to push through a defense establishment built around carrier-centric operations. Now, we need to acknowledge the complexity and limitations in this analysis, because nothing in warfare is certain and several factors could mitigate the threat China just demonstrated. First, these were exercises, not combat operations. The drones tracked a carrier group that was not actively evading detection, not employing the full range of electronic warfare capabilities available in actual combat, and not operating with the heightened alert status that would characterize a real crisis. Performance in training exercises does not always translate to performance in combat. Second, the United States Navy is not standing still. The service is investing heavily in counter-drone technologies, including directed energy weapons that could engage small autonomous platforms far more cost-effectively than missiles, improved radar systems specifically designed to detect low observable threats, and artificial intelligence systems that could identify and prioritize drone swarm threats automatically. Some of these systems are already being deployed to carrier strike groups. Whether they are mature enough to counter the threat China just demonstrated remains an open question, but it is not accurate to assume the U.S. has no response. Third, China's demonstration occurred in peacetime, with the implicit understanding that actually attacking a U.S. carrier would trigger full-scale war. The political and economic consequences of sinking an American carrier would be catastrophic for Beijing. $11 billion of hardware is significant, but 5,000 dead American sailors would create political pressure for retaliation that could escalate rapidly toward nuclear weapons. China's leadership understands this. The drone demonstration serves a deterrent and psychological function, but whether Beijing would actually authorize attacks on U.S. carriers in a Taiwan crisis remains uncertain. Fourth, and this is critical, targeting a carrier is not the same as sinking one. China demonstrated the ability to track the Reagan. That is a necessary but not sufficient condition for actually destroying it. The kill chain still requires launching missiles that can penetrate the carrier group's layered air defenses, achieve terminal guidance despite electronic warfare, and actually hit a maneuvering target. None of those steps are guaranteed. The U.S. Navy has invested enormous resources in missile defense systems precisely because senior leaders understand the carrier vulnerability problem. Whether those systems can defeat Chinese anti-ship missiles remains untested in combat. Fifth, Taiwan's defense does not depend solely on American carriers. The U.S. has multiple options for supporting Taiwan that do not require sailing carriers within range of Chinese missiles. Long-range bombers operating from Guam, submarines launching cruise missiles from positions off China's coast, and land-based anti-ship missiles deployed to allied nations like Japan and the Philippines could all contribute to Taiwan's defense while keeping high-value assets like carriers at safer distances. The loss of carrier-based options would complicate American strategy significantly, but it would not necessarily make Taiwan indefensible. All of these limitations are real and important. The situation is not as simple as China develops drone swarms, therefore American carriers are obsolete, therefore Taiwan is indefensible. But even accounting for complexity and uncertainty, the fundamental conclusion remains troubling. China has demonstrated a capability that significantly increases the risk to American naval operations in the Western Pacific. That increased risk affects both tactical operations and strategic deterrence, and the United States does not currently have clear answers to the problems this capability creates. What happens next matters enormously. The Pentagon will analyze this Chinese demonstration exhaustively, looking for weaknesses in the drone swarm concept, developing countermeasures, and refining operational plans for Taiwan contingencies. The Navy will likely accelerate deployment of counter-drone systems and may adjust carrier operating patterns to reduce vulnerability. Congress will hold hearings, and defense analysts will publish detailed assessments of the threat. But the strategic reality has shifted. China has publicly demonstrated that American carriers face genuine, credible threats when operating near Taiwan. That demonstration affects calculations in Beijing, Washington, Taipei, and every regional capital that depends on American security guarantees. The United States can no longer assume that naval dominance in the Western Pacific is assured. That assumption has been the foundation of Pacific strategy since 1945. Its erosion changes everything about how nations in the region think about their security and their relationships with both Washington and Beijing. For Taiwan specifically, this development is ominous. The island's survival depends entirely on the credibility of American military intervention. If Washington's ability to project power into the Taiwan Strait is genuinely in doubt, then Beijing's calculus about the costs and benefits of invasion shifts accordingly. Chinese leaders have always known that conquering Taiwan would be difficult and costly, but if they believe American carriers will not risk entering the battle space, the costs start to look manageable. That is a dangerous shift in strategic thinking. The question now is whether the United States can restore the deterrence equation before China concludes that a window of opportunity has opened. That restoration requires either developing and deploying effective countermeasures to Chinese drone swarms or fundamentally restructuring American strategy for Pacific operations around capabilities less vulnerable to this threat. Neither option is quick or easy. Both require resources, time, and political consensus that may not exist. What we just witnessed in the Taiwan Strait is not a crisis. Not yet. But it is a warning of how quickly the military balance can shift when new technologies mature. China spent 2 decades building the capabilities to challenge American naval dominance. They just demonstrated that those capabilities may actually work. The United States now faces a choice: accept the new strategic reality and adjust accordingly, or double down on investments to restore the advantage. That choice will define Pacific security for the next generation. If you want to understand how these developments unfold, how the United States responds, and what it means for the prospect of war or peace in the Taiwan Strait, subscribe to States News. We are going to be tracking this story closely, because what just happened is not the end of something. It is the beginning of a very uncertain period in great power competition. And understanding what comes next might be the most important analytical task any of us face in 2026.